I'm joined now in the studio by Lisa Collins from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's a fellow with their Korea chair. Well, the UN spoke forcefully early in the week, sanctions. It seems like the DPRK responded forcefully with a missile launch. And we're hearing the Trump administration kind of responding to this, given what we've seen in the past. Give me your thoughts about what are the next steps likely from the Trump administration?
So I think we're likely to see increased sanctions, both on the implementation front and perhaps through the United Nations. There will be United Nations sanctions, implementation and enforcement, and then possibly some additional unilateral sanctions through the Treasury Department. They have been designating some entities in the last couple of months from China and also Russia. And I think we may see some more secondary, that's what we call secondary sanctions. So we may see some more secondary sanctions coming out in the future.
But do they have an impact? I mean, a lot of people say it's never going to hurt the leadership in Pyongyang. It's the common people on the ground. And you were just hearing Jack Barton talking about Seoul trying to come up with humanitarian relief for the people there in the DPRK. I mean, your sense about that?
So I think that secondary sanctions will take some time to work, and we've only seen these sanctions being these entities being designated only recently. So it will take some time, I think, to figure out if they are working. But I think that there is a myth out there that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country in the world, and that's actually simply not true. If you look at even the U.S. designations in terms of the different sanctions regime done through the Treasury Department, North Korea is actually the 11th most sanctioned country or area of sanctioned entity. So I think that we will see the U.S. government try to do more on this front and work with China and Russia to implement what they've already passed through the United Nations.
It's interesting, the UNGA, of course, next week, obviously Donald Trump's going to speak, the president of the ROK as well. What are we likely to hear from both of them? Are they going to be the same kind of unified messages or different in a sense?
I'm sure that there will be coordination beforehand, so hopefully the messages will be unified and united. I think that the Trump administration will talk about coordination with allies, South Korea and Japan. Again, going on the maximum pressure and maximum diplomacy front, trying to work with countries around the world to put more pressure and more squeeze on North Korea. I think the South Korean president will, of course, talk about working with the United States, but I think that President Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, is very interested in the long term in diplomacy, ultimately with North Korea. He said yesterday at the National Security Council meeting that he called after the missile launch that it may not be the time right now for a dialogue with North Korea, but I do think that that's a plan that he has, at least in the long term. So I think we can anticipate that there will be some discussion around that as well.
I lifted this headline from an article in the New York Times in May because I want to talk about this dichotomy within the Trump administration. The headline said, UN says Trump budget cuts would make it impossible to do its job. It seems interesting, the Trump administration early on saying they want to slash, and now going to the UN on a regular basis, trying to get the UN to try and ratchet up the pressure on the DPRK. How do they square that?
So I think that's one thing that will probably have to be addressed in the future. Trying to make the UN work more efficiently is one question. I know that the Trump administration has proposed those budget cuts you were just talking about, but there are quite a lot of resources that go into doing the investigation necessary in order to do the sanctions designations that are done through the panel of experts in the United Nations. So they do need resources, research resources, investigative resources, resources to work with other countries around the world to try and increase the pressure on North Korea. So I do think that they will have to have some dialogue around that going forward.
And the double freeze proposal that China's put forward, the United States not embracing it, but are there any folks out there coming up with proposals like that where actually, because you talked about a diplomatic solution, it seems like that's where at some point it has to head.
So Russia and China have consistently said this. Every time there's a new missile test by North Korea, or as we saw about almost 2 weeks ago, the nuclear tests that happened, they consistently come out and say we should have all the parties come together and to decrease pressure in the region and to get together for dialogue. So I think that Russia and China will continue to make this proposal about the dialogue going forward.
All right, Lisa Collins, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here.